There were quieter signs too, moments when she dismissed the value of things I had worked hard for. When I bought her school supplies, she would toss them aside carelessly, already demanding the next trendy item. When I prepared meals after a long day at work, she would complain about wanting takeout instead, acting as though my effort was meaningless. I told myself it was typical teenage ingratitude, but the lack of appreciation cut deeper than I admitted, leaving small wounds that accumulated over the years. Looking back now, I wonder where it all began. Was it in those early years when I gave in too often, mistaking indulgence for love? Was it when I failed to impose consequences strong enough to teach her the weight of her actions? Or was it simply the world around her, friends, media, endless comparisons, that shaped her more than I could? Perhaps it was all of it together, a web of small missteps and outside influences that grew into something I could no longer control. The truth is, every act of disrespect I ignored became permission for the next. Every time I avoided confrontation to keep the peace, I was unknowingly surrendering a piece of authority. Each boundary crossed without consequence emboldened her to push further. What I saw as isolated incidents were, in fact, warning signs, signs I brushed aside because it was easier to hope than to face the truth. And so, when the coffee splashed across me, I shouldn't have been as shocked as I was. It wasn't a sudden betrayal, but the loudest echo of all the smaller betrayals that had come before. It was the climax of a story I had been too afraid to rewrite when I still had the chance. In the hours after the coffee incident, as I sat alone in the quiet of the living room, my thoughts turned inward. The anger and humiliation were still there, sharp and raw, but beneath them lay a heavier burden, questions that clawed at me, whispering doubts I could not silence. Was this entirely her fault, or did I have a hand in creating the daughter who now looked at me as though I were her enemy? Self-blame crept in quickly, as it always does with parents. I replayed every decision, every choice I had made in raising her. Had I been too indulgent when she was younger, teaching her that no was negotiable, that persistence would eventually earn her what she wanted? Or had I been too strict at times, pushing her away with rules and boundaries that she perceived as punishment rather than protection? Parenting often feels like walking a narrow bridge between two cliffs. On one side, permissiveness, on the other, control. I wondered if I had stumbled too often, wavering between the two instead of finding balance. At the same time, part of me wanted to lay the blame squarely on her shoulders. She was old enough to know better, old enough to understand that throwing coffee at someone, especially her own parent, was not just childish but cruel. I had not raised her without guidance. I had tried to show her the value of respect, the importance of gratitude, the meaning of love expressed through care rather than gifts. Yet, in her defiance, she rejected all of it. There was a voice inside me that insisted, she chose this path. She is responsible for her choices. Still, the fear of being a bad parent loomed over me. Society tells us, again and again, that a child's behavior is a reflection of their upbringing. If she was disrespectful, entitled, ungrateful, what did that say about me? Was I a failure, not only to her but to myself? Every act of rebellion, every cruel word she had spoken in past years suddenly piled up on my chest, suffocating me with the weight of responsibility. Parents are supposed to mold their children, guide them, correct them. If she was broken, then wasn't I, in some way, the one who had cracked her? I couldn't help but wonder if my attempts at discipline had pushed her further away. There were times I had been firm, insisting on rules she hated, curfews, limited spending, responsibilities around the house. Perhaps she saw these not as acts of care but as attempts to control her. Each refusal to hand over my card, each reminder that money was not infinite, may have carved deeper resentment into her heart. Was my strictness a shield I used to protect her, or a wall that shut her out? Yet love complicates everything. No matter how angry I was, no matter how humiliated, my love for her did not vanish. It pulsed through the disappointment like an ache that would not leave. I loved her too much to cast her aside, too much to stop caring. But that love was now tangled with something darker, a sense of betrayal that could not easily be undone. Love and disappointment wrestled inside me. One moment making me want to reach for her, the next making me want to retreat entirely. There were moments I wanted to storm into her room, demand an apology, force her to face what she had done. And yet, there were other moments where I longed simply to hold her, to remember the little girl she once was, the child who had reached for my hand without hesitation. These opposing desires left me paralyzed, caught between anger and compassion, punishment and forgiveness. As night fell and the house grew still, I sat with my thoughts and realized that this was the true torment of parenthood, to love someone so fiercely while simultaneously feeling crushed by their choices. To wonder endlessly if the fault lies in them, in you, or in the world that shaped them. To feel both victim and culprit in the same breath. I did not have answers, only questions that circled endlessly in my mind. Was I too harsh, or not harsh enough? Too giving, or too withholding? Too present, or too distant? Every possibility pointed to failure, and yet I knew that blaming myself entirely would strip her of responsibility for her own actions. Somewhere between us, in the space where love and disappointment collided, the truth must have lived. But in that moment, all I felt was the weight of being both parent and human, flawed, uncertain, and heartbreakingly vulnerable. It is impossible to understand my daughter's behavior without acknowledging the world she grew up in, a world so different from the one I knew as a child. Today's society whispers constantly into the ears of the young, telling them that their worth is measured by what they own, how they look, and how many people validate them online. For a teenager, those whispers aren't just suggestions. They become commands, shaping desires and identities in ways parents can hardly keep up with. Fashion was one of the first battlegrounds. When she was younger, clothes were just clothes. Bright dresses with cartoon characters, sneakers with flashing lights, things that made her happy without thought of cost. But as she entered her teenage years, fashion transformed into something else entirely, a competition. Every season brought a new must-have item. Every brand name carried weight. Every outfit had to signal status. I would watch her stand in front of the mirror, not to see if she liked how she looked, but to wonder if others would approve. It wasn't about comfort or even personal style anymore. It was about meeting the unspoken standards set by her peers. Then came the gadgets. Phones, headphones, tablets. Always newer, faster, sleeker. What struck me wasn't just her desire for them, but the panic she felt at the thought of falling behind. She would compare her phone's model to her friends as though it were a scoreboard of her value. If someone had the latest device, she immediately felt her own was obsolete, even if it worked perfectly fine. I tried to explain that technology's race never ends, that there would always be something newer on the horizon, but my words seemed powerless against the pressure of her social circle. And beyond her peers were the influencers, celebrities, and endless feeds of polished lives on social media. Scrolling through her phone, she was fed a constant diet of luxury, flawless makeup tutorials, vacations on white sand beaches, closets full of designer clothes. These weren't just images, they were ideals. To her, they represented what life should be, what happiness looked like. The fact that most of it was curated, filtered, or outright staged didn't matter. She believed what she saw. The more she consumed, the more dissatisfied she became with her own reality. I could see how badly she wanted to fit in, how much it meant to her to belong. She didn't just want the dress or the phone or the shoes. She wanted the acceptance that came with them, the validation that she wasn't less than the people around her. She measured her worth against likes on a photo, the number of friends who praised her outfit, the ability to show off something new. It hurt me to realize that no matter how much love I poured into her, it was never enough to counterbalance the weight of the world's judgment. For me, it was a constant clash with modern consumerism. I was raised in a world where money meant survival. Food on the table, electricity in the house, school fees paid on time. Luxuries were rare, treasured because they were earned after sacrifice. I tried to carry those values into my parenting, believing they were timeless. But to her, my mindset seemed outdated, stingy even, in a society that preached indulgence as self-expression. Where I saw limits, she saw deprivation. Where I saw responsibility, she saw punishment. Our arguments often circled this divide. She would accuse me of not understanding her world, of being stuck in the past. And in some ways, she was right. I could not fully grasp the relentless pull of online culture, the way it invaded her sense of self every waking moment. But I also knew that the path it pushed her down was dangerous, one where identity was bound to possessions and happiness was always one purchase away. That was the battle I fought every time I said no. Not against her, but against a society that had convinced her she wasn't enough without something more. The house remained tense for hours after the coffee incident, the silence between us louder than any shouting could have been. I changed my clothes, cleaned the mess, and tried to steady myself, but the weight of what had happened refused to lift. Eventually, I knew I couldn't let it sit unspoken. Something had to be said. So later that evening, when the air had cooled but the wound was still raw, I knocked on her door. She didn't answer at first. When I opened it, she was sprawled on her bed, phone in hand, scrolling through her feed as though nothing had happened. The sight of her calmness, her indifference, stoked my anger, but I swallowed it down. "We need to talk," I said. She rolled her eyes, locked her phone, and sat up slowly. "About what? You already said no. What's left to say?" Her tone was defensive, clipped, daring me to start another fight. I sat at the edge of a desk chair and tried to keep my voice level. "About earlier. About the way you treated me. Throwing coffee at me isn't just an argument. It's violence. It's crossing a line you can't uncross." For a moment, she avoided my gaze, picking at the edge of a blanket. Then she snapped back. "You don't get it. You never do. I was angry because you never listen. You just keep telling me no like I'm a child, like I can't make my own decisions. All I wanted was to go shopping with my friends. Everyone else's parents let them. Why do you always have to be different?" Her words stung, partly because they were laced with contempt, but also because I could hear the raw frustration in them. She truly believed she was being deprived of something essential. "I'm different," I said, "because I'm your parent. My job isn't to give you everything you ask for, it's to prepare you for life. You think money grows on trees, that you can swipe a card endlessly and never think of the consequences." She crossed her arms tightly. "It's not about money, it's about you controlling me. You act like keeping me from having things will make me stronger, but all it does is make me look weak in front of everyone else. Do you know what it feels like to be the only one who can't keep up?" I sighed, tiredness washing over me. "I do know. I grew up with less than you can imagine. I went to school with hammer-down clothes. I watched my friends get things I couldn't afford. But you know what? It made me appreciate what I had. It taught me to work for what I wanted. That's what I'm trying to teach you. Not to punish you, not to control you, but to give you strength." Her eyes flashed with frustration. "That's your story, not mine. Why should I have to suffer just because you did? Why should I live by your rules when the world I live in now isn't the same as when you grew up?" And there it was, the generational divide, wide and unforgiving. To her, my values were relics of another time, outdated lessons from a world without social media, influences, and constant pressure to display wealth. To me, her world seemed shallow, fragile, built on illusions that would crumble the moment real life set in. "You think suffering is the point?" I asked softly. "It's not. The point is learning responsibility. If I give you everything now, if I hand over the card every time you ask, what happens when I'm not here anymore? Who will teach you how to say no to yourself? Who will teach you that you can't always have what you want?" She looked at me then, really looked, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw her armor crack. But it was gone in an instant. "You'll never understand," she muttered, grabbing her phone again. "You want me to live like you, but I won't. I can't." The conversation ended not with resolution, but with silence. I left her room heavy-hearted, realizing that no amount of words could bridge the chasm between us in that moment. We were speaking different languages. I, the language of responsibility and restraint. She, the language of desire and belonging. And though both came from love in their own way, they collided like storms, leaving only wreckage in their wake. As I closed her door gently behind me, I knew this wasn't the end of our battle. It was only the beginning of a longer war, one not just between parent and child, but between generations, between values, between two ways of seeing the world. The days that followed were wrapped in a heavy silence, the kind that seeps into every corner of the house and makes even ordinary sounds, footsteps, doors closing, dishes clinking, feel louder than they should. After our confrontation, neither of us seemed willing to break the quiet. She retreated into her room, her music muffled behind the door, her presence in the house reduced to shadows slipping in and out. When we crossed paths in the hallway or at the table, she barely looked at me, her eyes fixed anywhere else, her answers clipped down to a single syllable if she bothered to respond at all. I tried at first to reach across the distance. A gentle good morning, a question about school, even a simple offer of dinner. Each attempt was met with indifference, sometimes with nothing at all. The rejection stung more than I wanted to admit. After a while, I stopped trying so often, afraid that my efforts only deepened her resistance. It felt like living with a stranger, someone who wore my daughter's face but carried none of the warmth I remembered. For me, the silence was suffocating. I carried it with me into every moment, even when she wasn't in the room. I found myself lingering on memories of her laughter, the way she used to come running to me with stories from her day, the simple joy of hearing her chatter fill the house. Now there was only quiet, and in that quiet, my mind replayed the coffee incident again and again, searching for the moment I could have stopped it, wondering if I had pushed her too far. My love for her hadn't diminished, but it had become heavy, laced with sadness and helplessness. And yet, in the edges of her silence, I thought I saw something else, something like unspoken guilt. There were times when she lingered at the doorway, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. Times when her eyes flickered toward me, softer for just a second, before she quickly turned away. I don't know if she regretted what she had done or if she was simply unwilling to admit it. Either way, the silence between us held both our emotions, my quiet suffering, her hidden remorse. It stretched on for days, then weeks, a fragile truce built not on healing but on avoidance. And in that emptiness, the distance between us grew wider, threatening to become permanent. After the silence had dragged on too long, I began to feel the need to reach outside myself for guidance. I couldn't keep turning the situation over in my mind alone. I needed another perspective, even if it wasn't what I wanted to hear. So, one evening, I called a close friend who had raised 2 children of her own. I explained what had happened, my voice catching at the part where I described the coffee spilling across me. She was sympathetic, but blunt. "You've been too lenient," she said. "You've let her think she's the one in control. Kids need to know where the line is, and they need consequences when they cross it." Her words stung because they touched on a truth I had been trying to avoid. When I confided in a relative, however, I heard a different opinion. My sister, who had always been softer in her parenting, told me, "Teenagers lash out when they feel misunderstood. Maybe she feels you too strict, too closed off to her world. You can't just say no all the time. You have to compromise sometimes." That suggestion frustrated me. Hadn't I compromised enough already? But I couldn't dismiss her words entirely either, because part of me wondered if my firmness had built walls instead of bridges. The conflicting advice left me more torn than before. Some pointed the finger at me, saying I had failed to discipline properly. Others blamed her, saying she was spoiled, that she had to learn the hard way. And somewhere in between, I stood, caught in the web of doubt and love, unable to decide who was truly at fault. In my desperation, I began to consider professional help. Maybe therapy, either for her, for me, or for both of us. The thought of sitting across from a counselor, speaking the words aloud in a stranger's office, was daunting, almost embarrassing. What kind of parent admits their child has crossed such a line? But at the same time, I knew silence and avoidance weren't working. Perhaps we needed a mediator, someone trained to untangle the knots we kept pulling tighter. I even found myself browsing through parenting books late at night, scrolling online forums where other parents shared their struggles. Some spoke of strict methods, taking away privileges, cutting off allowances, grounding for weeks. Others swore by patience and empathy, urging parents to listen without judgment. Every philosophy seemed convincing in its own way, yet none felt like a perfect fit for us. Ours wasn't a textbook situation. It was messier, more personal, weighted with years of complicated emotions. As I searched for answers, I realized the truth might not lie in one approach but in a combination. Firmness without cruelty, compassion without surrender, responsibility balanced with understanding. But knowing that in theory was very different from applying it in the raw, painful reality of our household. At night, I lay awake wondering if I was strong enough to carry us both through this storm. Seeking advice had given me voices to listen to. But ultimately, the decision, how to parent her, how to repair what had been broken, rested on me. And that weight was both frightening and humbling. A reminder that parenthood is a journey with no clear map, only choices that shape the path as you walk it. The turning point did not come through another argument at home, but from outside, an event neither of us could have predicted. It began when she came home from school one afternoon with her shoulders slumped, her usual sharpness dulled. She went straight to her room without a word, but I could hear the muffled sound of her crying. That in itself was unusual. She rarely let her vulnerability show. Later, after hours of silence, I gently knocked on her door. She didn't tell me much at first, only fragments between sobs. A friend she had trusted deeply had betrayed her, mocking her behind her back in front of others. The cruelest part was that the betrayal centered not on who she was, but on what she didn't have: the expensive clothes, the endless stream of gadgets. The very things she had fought me for had become weapons against her, used to humiliate her rather than raise her up. In that moment, I saw a crack in her armor. For the first time, she admitted that trying to keep up with her peers had left her exhausted. She confessed how anxious she felt scrolling through social media, how every image made her feel smaller, poorer, less worthy. It was as though the glittering world she had chased had finally turned against her, and she didn't know how to handle the emptiness it left behind. For me, that day forced a reflection of my own. I had spent weeks locked in my own pain, replaying the coffee incident, dwelling on her disrespect. But seeing her cry reminded me that beneath the defiance was still a child struggling to find her place. Perhaps I had been so focused on teaching her lessons that I forgot to acknowledge how hard her world really was. I began to wonder if my approach had been too rigid, too focused on the no without enough space for understanding. My boundaries were necessary, yes, but maybe they had been delivered without enough softness, without enough reassurance that my love was unconditional, even when I denied her. The combination of her betrayal and my self-reflection shifted something between us. The next evening, I tried again to talk to her, but this time, instead of lecturing, I asked questions. I asked how she felt when her friend turned on her. I asked what it was like to feel that pressure every day at school. Slowly, she opened up. She admitted she had thought material things would shield her from cruelty, that if she looked the part, no one could make her feel small. But now she saw that no matter how much she had, it was never enough. Someone would always have more. The realization was painful for her, but necessary. Entitlement had promised her happiness, but all it had delivered was disappointment. She began to see, in her own words, that constantly demanding luxuries hadn't made her stronger or more respected. It had made her dependent on things that could vanish in an instant. For me, the turning point was recognizing that my role wasn't just to say no, but to guide her through the emotions behind that no. I needed to balance firmness with compassion, to show her not only why limits existed, but how they could protect her from a world that thrives on making people feel inadequate. That week became a fragile but important step forward. She wasn't magically transformed, nor was I, but we both began to see the cracks in our own thinking. She saw that entitlement had consequences far beyond getting what she wanted. And I saw that parenting wasn't only about holding the line. It was also about holding her, even when she pushed me away. The first steps toward reconciliation were hesitant, almost clumsy, like walking across thin ice and praying it would hold. After the incident with her friend, there was a noticeable shift in the air between us. She wasn't as sharp, not as eager to pick a fight over every little thing. For days, she avoided the subject of the coffee, as though pretending it hadn't happened might erase it. I carried the memory in silence too. But inside me, the need for resolution grew stronger. One evening, after dinner, I decided the moment had come. I asked her to sit with me in the living room, away from her phone, away from distractions. She hesitated at first, her eyes darting toward the door like she was already planning her escape. But something in my voice must have convinced her, because she sat, pulling her knees up to her chest, her face half hidden in her arms. I need to talk about what happened, I began carefully. Not just the coffee, but everything leading up to it. We can't pretend it didn't happen. We need to face it. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, so softly I almost missed it, she muttered, "I'm sorry." The words were fragile, reluctant, but they carried weight. It wasn't an elaborate apology. There was no tearful embrace or dramatic confession, but it was more than I had expected. I let the silence hold it, resisting the urge to demand more. Sometimes even small steps matter. "I know you were angry," I said, "but anger doesn't excuse hurting the people you love. Respect matters, not just for me as your parent, but for yourself. When you throw things, when you lash out, you damage more than clothes or carpets. You damage trust. And trust is harder to repair than any stain." Her eyes flicked up toward me, guilt flickering there before she quickly looked away. "You don't understand how much pressure I feel," she said, her voice cracking with frustration. "Everyone expects me to have everything. I feel like I'm being judged all the time." "I believe you," I answered gently. "I may not know what it's like to live in your world exactly, but I do know what it feels like to want to belong. And I know that chasing approval through things never works. It only leaves you emptier. That's why I say no sometimes, not because I don't care, but because I do. Love isn't about swiping a card every time you ask. It's about teaching you how to stand strong even when you don't have what others do." She shifted uncomfortably, picking at a loose thread on the couch. "But when you say no, it feels like you don't trust me, like you think I can't handle things." "It's not about trust," I replied. "It's about responsibility. You can't build a life on taking. You have to learn to balance, to earn, to respect limits. That's what money teaches us if we let it. Not power, not status, but responsibility." The conversation stretched on, sometimes quiet, sometimes tense. I explained, as calmly as I could, the boundaries I needed to set. The credit card was not hers to use at will. Large purchases would not be granted on impulse. If she wanted extras beyond her needs, she would have to find ways to earn them. Through saving, through work, through patience. I expected respect in return. Not perfection, but respect. She didn't agree easily. There were sighs, rolled eyes, muttered complaints. But she didn't storm off. She stayed, and that alone felt like progress. By the end of the evening, nothing was magically solved. There were no hugs, no grand declarations of reconciliation. But the ice between us had cracked, just a little. She had listened, even if reluctantly. I had spoken my truth without shouting, without letting anger win. The apology she offered may have been small, but it was real. And sometimes, reconciliation doesn't come in waves. It comes in drops, slowly filling the empty spaces left by hurt. That night, as I turned off the lights, I allowed myself a fragile hope. The road ahead would not be easy, but perhaps we had taken our first true steps toward walking it together again. Resolution didn't arrive in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet realizations, stitched together through many late-night talks, small changes, and gestures that slowly rebuilt what had been broken. After weeks of tension and reflection, both of us began to see things differently. Herself, her world, and me as her parent. For her, the biggest lesson was about money. She had spent years believing that luxuries were not luxuries at all, but necessities to prove her worth. Yet after the betrayal by her friend, after sitting with the weight of our fights, she admitted that chasing things had left her emptier than she ever expected. Slowly, she began to understand that money was more than a card swiped at will. It was effort, labor, and sacrifice translated into numbers. She started asking questions she had never asked before, about bills, about savings, about why we couldn't always afford what others had. And while she didn't stop wanting, she began to recognize that wanting and deserving were not the same thing. Respect, she began to see, wasn't bought with clothes or gadgets. For me, the lesson was about communication and discipline. I had clung too tightly to my role as enforcer, thinking that firmness alone would be enough to shape her. But discipline without conversation had only hardened her defiance. I realized that I needed to explain not just the rules, but the heart behind them. Saying no wasn't enough. I had to show her that my refusals came from love, not from indifference or control. I also saw where I had been inconsistent, sometimes giving in when I was tired, sometimes holding the line too rigidly. It wasn't only her who needed balance. It was me too. The healing process of trust was slow, fragile, but real. We started by rebuilding the smallest rituals, sharing meals together without phones, going for short walks in the evenings, talking not about money or responsibilities, but about movies, books, and her dreams for the future. These small exchanges reminded us of the bond beneath the arguments, the love that still tied us together even when anger had nearly severed it. Then came the symbolic gesture that sealed our progress. One afternoon, she handed me a folded envelope. Inside was a portion of money she had earned from tutoring a younger student. A small amount, but entirely hers. "I want to buy my own dress with this," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Not with your card. I want to use what I earned." It was such a simple act, but in that moment, it felt monumental. Not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented, an acknowledgement of responsibility, a step toward independence that wasn't rooted in entitlement. I didn't stop her. I didn't lecture her. I simply hugged her, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself be held. That small gesture carried more weight than any words we had exchanged. It was her way of saying she understood, her way of offering forgiveness, not only for what had happened, but for the hurt that had lingered between us. And in return, it was my way of forgiving her, not by erasing the past, but by choosing to move forward with her. The coffee incident would always remain a scar, a reminder of how far anger and misunderstanding had taken us. But scars, I realized, are not only marks of pain. They are proof of healing too. And though our relationship was far from perfect, we both carried new lessons. She, that love and respect cannot be bought, and I, that love must be spoken as well as enforced. Together, we began to walk toward something stronger, not free of conflict, but grounded in a deeper understanding of each other. The coffee incident became the line in the sand, the moment that divided our story into a before and after. For weeks it haunted me. The heat of the liquid, the sting on my skin, the shock of watching my daughter's anger take shape in something so physical. At first, I thought it would only remain as a symbol of our brokenness, a reminder that we had reached a point beyond repair. Yet, as time passed and we slowly began to speak again, I realized it was also the turning point that forced us both to look honestly at who we had become to each other. Without that moment, painful as it was, perhaps we would have kept sliding further apart without ever confronting the truth. When I look back now, I see the coffee not only as an act of violence but as a desperate cry, a raw, misguided attempt at being heard. It hurt me deeply, but it also stripped away the illusions we had both been clinging to. She could no longer pretend that her demands had no consequences, and I could no longer pretend that my way of parenting was working. It was a moment that forced us both to change. Our relationship after that day has been stronger, though not without caution. Trust, once cracked, takes time to rebuild. I still flinch sometimes at the memory, and she still hesitates when she asks for something, as though afraid of repeating the past. We tread more carefully now, but within that caution lies a kind of strength. We have learned to choose our words with more care, to listen before we react, to pause before we escalate. The arguments haven't disappeared entirely, but they have shifted in tone. They are less about shouting, more about struggling to understand. For her, The lessons of respect and responsibility are still unfolding. She has begun to see that love is not measured in material things, that dignity does not come from keeping up appearances. She has started to earn her own money in small ways, and though she still dreams of luxuries, she talks now about saving for them, about planning instead of demanding. It is a slow transformation, but I see in her the beginnings of maturity, the faint but steady steps toward adulthood. For me, the lesson has been about balance. I have learned that parenting cannot rely solely on firmness, nor can it bend endlessly to avoid conflict. Love must be expressed not only through boundaries but through patience, conversation, and humility. I have learned to admit when I am wrong, to show her that I am human too. And in doing so, I hope to teach her that strength is not in control, but in connection. Hope for the future remains fragile but present, like a small flame that must be tended carefully. There will be more battles ahead. I know that. She is still young, still searching for her place in a world that demands more than it gives. I am still learning to guide without crushing, to let go without abandoning. But the fact that we now walk forward with awareness, with lessons carved from pain, gives me reason to believe we will endure. Sometimes, when I pass the spot where the coffee spilled, I remember how final it felt in that moment, how it seemed to signal the end of everything. Now, I see it differently. It was not the end, but the beginning of something new, a relationship remade through fire, scarred but stronger. The stain has long since been cleaned, but the memory remains, not as a wound that festers, but as a reminder of what we overcame. And so, moving forward, I carry both the hurt and the healing. I carry the memory of coffee burning my skin, and I carry the image of my daughter handing me her own hard-earned money, showing me that she had listened, that she had changed. Life as a parent will never be without struggle, but now I know that even in the most painful moments, there can be growth. One day, when we look back together, perhaps we will both see that spilled coffee not only as the moment that broke us, but as the moment that forced us to rebuild. A bitter drink turned bitterer by anger, yes, but also the beginning of a sweeter understanding between us.